So, last time I updated, Faye's older sister Becca came to visit with her infant son Caleb. The presence of a child seems to have awakened something in Faye, because her sleep disturbances became even more erratic, and her unusual behavior was just intensified. They stayed for almost a week, but left abruptly after a few weird experiences with Faye. Becca seemed to be growing angry with Faye over the course of a few days, although I could never really discern why. One night when Faye was asleep, Becca and I sat on the couch and talked about what was happening. I asked her why she seemed so hostile towards her sister. She wouldn't even speak to her that day. Becca replied that Faye really has a problem letting things go. If she's mad at someone, she's mad for weeks. If she's hurt for years. She can't forgive and she cannot forget. I asked, did you do something to make her mad? Are you two fighting? Becca denied that there was any sort of conflict. She said that she was speaking in general terms, having grown up with Faye. I asked her if there was something in the past that made Faye angry, and Becca sharply responded, nobody did anything to Faye. Nothing happened to her. At that point, she stood up and went upstairs, claiming she needed to check on Caleb, and closed the door without even saying goodnight. Faye is sometimes difficult to handle because she's proud and stubborn, and the strongest person I've ever met. But her sister, she's like an obsidian wall. You cannot get any information out of her. You can't read her poker face. You can't know what she's really thinking, ever. But I know that she knows something. Maybe I can get it out of her, I don't know. But I'd figure I'd be able to get it out of her mom. Becca and Faye's mom, Laura, agreed to Skype chat with me this week. This time, I am going for the throat. I've successfully removed all the vomit stains in the house, so Faye isn't talking to them in the dark anymore. But she's still getting worse. I feel like she's just slipping away. Seeing Faye hold Caleb on the couch with her eyes rolled back and smiling was one of the most disturbing memories I have of this entire ordeal. There's something about Faye and that child that deeply unsettles me. I've been keeping quiet and trying to make sure that Caleb is safe. I have no reason to believe that Faye would do anything to hurt another person, except for that one time in college when she punched a drunk girl at a party for grabbing my ass and saying I'd hit it. But as far as animal and kids go, Faye is simply angelic. The night that Becca stormed off mid-conversation, Faye did something odd. I woke up to her mumbling in the dark, and when I turned on the light, I saw her standing at the far end of the room, cradling a pillow in her arms, and swaying back and forth, kind of half singing a lullaby. The words were unrecognizable, but the melody sounded distinctly familiar. I called out to her and said, "Sweetie, what are you doing?" She replied in a low, grumbly voice, "I always wanted to be the big sister." Her speech was slurred. She sounded drugged. I got up and gently ushered her back to bed and took the pillow away. And when I did, she said, "Now I want to be a mommy." I rubbed her neck and assured her that we would start a family one day, and that she would be a great mom. She then mumbled, "He's a little corpse." I asked what does that mean, and she never replied. She just started that rhythmic breathing that lets you know your partner is fast asleep. Angela visited our house again the next evening, just after the sun went down. For those who don't recall, Angela belongs to the Shoshone tribe in California. She is the daughter of a very important tribal leader. She first visited me and Faye when we got back to California, and told us that a malevolent spirit called the Hollow One was infatuated with my fiancé. She said that there was a dark cloud over Faye that could not be easily removed. This time, Angela brought her friend, who was a hypnotist. They inspected the house and the yard. We told them about the barf stains, and Faye's claimed that he was in the stains. He gets up at night and walks around in the dark. Then, in private, I told them about the baby's presence and how it exacerbated Faye's behavior. I also showed them where I found the new dream catcher. Angela said the entity has many names. and it's known to several different Native American groups. It is older than the Skinwalkers, and that it is the progenitor of many evil spirits that inhabit different places near the Rocky Mountains and in the Southwest. Her friend referred to it as a soul trader that snatches up a person's essence, then takes that down into the dark. Then it enters the remaining body to seek out more victims. I don't know where the dark is, but allegedly that is where Faye is heading. With too much exposure to this thing, both Faye and I have become tainted by it, which is why we were vomiting that dark bile, and the stains carried remnants of the evil. Angela spoke with Faye for a long time, and concluded that it was still Faye, but on her way to somewhere else. She's making a spiritual journey to a place that she thinks is good and safe. But in reality, she's just being coaxed out of this world. Despite what's happening to us, a lot of this whimsical metaphysical talk, it's sometimes hard for me to swallow. But the hypnotist session with Faye did a good job in convincing me that there is something here, inside the house with us, always watching. The hypnotist had Faye lie flat on our bed, and we brought chairs up from the dining room to sit with her. She put her hand on Faye's forehead and hummed a chant for a while. Then covered Faye's eyes with her palm and asked her a few questions. They were things like, what is your name? Who is your fiancé? All of Faye's answers were normal. The hypnotist then hummed some more and then lifted her hand. Faye's eyes were rolled back in her head, which only happens when she's in a sleepwalking state. Her mouth was twitching a little bit too. The hypnotist asked, "Who are you?" And she responded, "I am Faye." The important bits of the conversation went something like this. "Faye, can you tell us who's in the house?" Faye raised her arm slowly and pointed at each person in the room and said their name, even though she wasn't even looking at them. She knew where everyone was. Felix, Becca, Angela, you. And then she pointed at the wall and said, "Caleb. He was in the other room." The hypnotist asked, "Is there anyone else? What about the man who's been following you?" She shook her head and said, "Right now, he's outside." We all glanced outside the window to the tree line where I had first seen the figure walking back and forth in the middle of the night, mimicking Faye's sleepwalking. This time, there was no one there. Angela asked, "What does he say to you? Is he talking to you right now?" Faye replied, "I can't hear him. He's facing the other way." The hypnotist asked, "What are the dream catchers for? Who makes them?" Faye did not respond. She just smiled a bit. I butted in and said, "Honey, I found your hair wrapped in the dream catcher outside. Did you do that?" She put her finger up to her lips and shushed me. Then she put her palm flat against the wall, like she was feeling for a pulse. After a few minutes, she said, "He's here." Right when she finished her sentence, Caleb burst into tears. Becca and Angela rushed out of the room to go check on him. The hypnotist and I, we remained with Faye. The hypnotist finally went for broke and said, "Faye, sweetie, you wrote the number 5 on a window in the other room. You wrote it backwards. Why did you do that? What does it mean? Did you write it for someone outside to see?" In that moment, Faye's eyes rolled forward. Her little green irises finally showed. She immediately looked toward the door into the hall and said, No, he's listening now." And then she began hyperventilating and struggled to speak the words, "He'll find out." The last thing she said was, "Felix," in a deep guttural voice. It definitely wasn't her own. Then the hypnotist pressed her hand against Faye's eyes and spoke a loud command in her native language. I think it was Shoshone, but I'm not exactly sure what group she's affiliated with. Faye immediately woke up. She seemed very confused on where she was and then started crying and reached out for me. I hurried over and held her in my arms. Her body was so cold. It was like she was a corpse. When she was crying, she said, "He wants to kill you. He wants you dead. I saw you. I saw you in the trees." Angela and the hypnotist, I haven't given her name by the way because I don't want you to have to memorize a million names. We hurried around the house, blessing it and burning sage. Then also recommended that I call a Catholic priest for Faye's personal comfort, since she is a Catholic. They left after a few words of parting. Becca seemed really angry and scared at this point. She remained in her guest room for the rest of the night. I got a call about an hour later from Angela. She told me that she had discussed the situation with the hypnotist, and they believe Faye is in extreme denial about something. Perhaps some sort of trauma. They said she had repressed it so well that it was consigned to a place in her subconscious that only years of therapy or hypnosis could unearth it. It was a place in her mind that can't even be accessed by talking to her in her sleep. That is where the number 5 rests. And that's why the entity hasn't found it yet. Despite communicating with Faye in her sleep virtually every night, he's been drilling her brain like a miner digging for gold. And the fun, it didn't end there. We all went to sleep pretty early that night because of all the drama, but as I've learned on so many other occasions, going to sleep upset usually results in night terrors or some other sleep disturbance for Faye. At about 2 a.m., she leapt out of bed, jolting me awake in the process, and bombed down the hall like there was a fire. She started bashing her fist on the guest room door, but didn't utter a single word. Her eyes were shut. I flicked on the light and stood there in the hall for just a second, scared completely stiff. When Caleb started to cry, I snapped out of it and rushed over. I bear hugged my fiancée to try to get her to stop making so much noise, and in return, she tried to bite me. Faye has never been violent towards me in her life. Even in her sleep, she was a very passive sleepwalker. Creepy, but passive. This time, she tried to rip my throat out. She was trying to draw blood. I fended her off and sort of apprehended her. I walked her back to the bedroom. She was basically wearing me like a straitjacket. When I carefully put her back into bed, she whispered, "He'll go up in the trees. You went down in the hall." Becca was understandably furious the next day, but she swallowed her anger and drove Faye down to the Catholic church in the town center. I went to work. Apparently, they finally got one of the priests to agree to a visit next week to bless the house. They explained that this wouldn't be enough, so he'd have to speak with the bishop of the diocese. That could take a while. This evening, Becca informed me that she changed her flight, and now she intended to leave in 2 days. I begged her to set aside her differences with Faye to help get through to her. I said Faye needs her big sister right now, but Becca, she wouldn't budge. She seems to be holding on to a monolithic grudge about something neither of them will tell me. I ordered pizza, Faye's favorite, in a lame attempt of lightening the mood around the house. But the two would only have casual, light conversation with each other. The tension in the house was so thick, I could feel it in my stomach. Faye and I retired to our room early to watch Game of Thrones in bed. We always recorded it on Sundays because Faye's at work. Then we would watch it during the week. I asked her if she remembered telling me about the imposter wanting me dead, or that I would be put up in the trees. She said that she didn't recall any of it, but she did have a dream about seeing me impaled on a tree branch high up in the air. She said my skin and hair were missing. Faye fell asleep pretty quickly, but I couldn't sleep at all. I remember that Nathan, T-Way's son, had left me a voicemail a few days prior, and I had forgotten to call him back. So I grabbed my phone and went downstairs. The house was quiet. Becca and Caleb were already asleep upstairs. I turned the TV on low to mask my conversation with Nathan. It was midnight in Colorado, but he still answered the phone. He asked me how everything was going. I told him everything. Nathan, he had a lot to say. He apologized for making me and Faye sick, but he said that the simple purging process was a very common treatment for many physical and spiritual maladies in his tribe. However, by my description of the barf stain events, it obviously didn't work, and we were still under the influence of the imposter. He said that if we came back to Colorado, he would bring us to the elders of his community and request that they perform a more serious healing ritual. I told him that that would be Faye's call entirely. I doubt she would go, or that the imposter would let her. Last month, when I was in the cabin by myself, there was a blizzard that shut down the only road to the mountain. The ranger couldn't come up to check on me, but T-Way and Nathan, being the badass gentlemen that they are, actually hiked up the mountain through the snow to check up on me. You can go back and listen to that story. But basically, on their hike back down, they heard Faye's voice calling out to them from one of the abandoned mines on Pikes Peak. T-Way went to investigate, and he was dragged into the dark by some unseen creature or animal. Nathan eventually found him dead. Parts of his skin had been flayed. The reason that I hadn't been able to get a hold of Nathan for several days was because he and a group of men from his community went back to Pikes Peak to investigate the circumstances around his father's death, and to explore the cabin. They camped out for a few nights, and eventually spent one night in the woods next to the cabin. Nathan heard T-Way's voice calling out for help over and over. He was crying and calling Nathan's name. However, occasionally the voice would cut out to Zuni, which is a language that some of the Pueblo tribes speak, but their tribe does not. They speak Hopi. So Nathan was fairly certain that this was not, in fact, his father. They also heard children weeping in the forest. One of Nathan's friends left the tent to take a piss, and he claimed that he saw a naked child with grayish skin standing a dozen yards off, facing away, looking up in the trees. He looked like a stiff corpse, and was standing on the balls of his feet. This apparently scared Nathan's friend so bad that he took off. He grabbed his things and went to hike back down the mountain, in the dark, in the cold, by himself. Nathan and the others tried to stop him, but it was too dangerous to go after him. They haven't seen him since. Nathan told me that he had reoccurring dreams of a child while on the mountain. Of a child, and of Faye. He said, "Tell me about the child, Felix." During our conversation, I had been standing in the living room facing the sliding glass doors, looking out into the backyard. Right when Nathan said, "Tell me about the child," I saw a large shadow move behind the orange trees outside. I told Nathan to hold on a second and went to grab the flashlight from the kitchen. When I got there, I almost collapsed in fright. The front door was wide open. From the front door, you could see the tree line across the street. Someone was walking behind the trees. I could see them slowly moving between them. I sat down the phone and ran upstairs to wake Faye and Becca, but Faye wasn't in bed. I frantically rushed to Becca's room to see if Faye was with her, but Becca was asleep, and she was really disturbed by my urgency when I woke her up. We turned on the light. She went to grab Caleb, but he wasn't in the little crib Faye had bought for him. He was gone. Becca turned into the Hulk in about half a second flat. She started shrieking in rage and terror, screaming, "Where is he? Where is my baby?" over and over. We dashed around the house looking for Faye and Caleb, but we couldn't find them. And that's when I realized she had taken him outside. We ran out barefoot straight to the trees. I came up behind Faye. My fiancée was standing there in her underwear looking up at the trees, her arms outstretched holding up Caleb off into the air, as if offering him to someone above. High up on one of the tree branches was the dream catcher, the one I had taken down and broken only days earlier. Now it was completely intact. Becca grabbed Caleb out of Faye's arms and shoved her to the ground, then took the baby back inside. I picked up Faye and rushed her back into the house. The neighbors were starting to come out of their homes with all the commotion. Faye woke up on our way back upstairs, and she broke down crying, apologizing for scaring both of us. Becca packed all of her things and stormed out of the house, grabbing Faye's car keys and just drove off. The police showed up within a few minutes, and I had to explain to them that the sisters had a big fight and it got taken outside. I said Faye was drunk, so she took it a bit too far and ran across the street. Thankfully, nobody saw the baby, so I didn't get arrested for child endangerment. What else could I have said? They would have never believed me if I told them the truth. They checked Faye out to make sure she hadn't gotten beaten up, asked repeatedly if I was treating her alright, then they left. Becca drove straight to the airport. Faye and I had to go pick up her car the next day. I've got a Skype chat scheduled with Faye's mom tomorrow. Becca texted me and said, ask her about the 5. She knows. If I can get an answer out of her, I'll post a brief update here. But I won't make another post for a while. I'm sorry. Thank you for all the support over this past time. Now, I need to try to put all the broken pieces of my life back together. I am so sorry for the length of this post. It is just enormous. I actually have to split it into 2 parts because of Reddit's word count limit. But this is it. For better or for worse, the end has finally come. After I post the other half of this update in a couple days, I will never speak of these events again. I've lost far too much, and it hurts way too deep to continue. It has been a long time since I talked about my fiancée and the events surrounding our vacation at her parents' cabin in Colorado. But I think enough time has passed. I have finally unearthed the secrets Faye's family has been hiding from me. No Sleep has been remarkably supportive, so even though what I'm about to tell you is deeply, deeply personal, you've helped us get this far. You deserve to know what I found. We moved about 2 weeks ago. I got a new job, so we found a place a few towns over. It's only an hour's drive from our old place, and it's the same distance from Faye's work, just in the opposite direction. As if by law of horror film cliches, the strange activity that plagued us at night ceased entirely for a week when we moved into our new place. However, it started right back up again after a while, just as I feared it would have. Our new home had not yet been blessed by Angela when the activity started up again. She is the daughter of a Shoshone tribal elder who saged and blessed our old home a few weeks prior. The imposter has not given up on Faye. Its game is to wear us down until we just give up. I had a Skype chat set up with Faye's very reticent mother, but per No Sleep warnings, I waited until after we moved. The fear was that Laura might divulge something over Skype that the imposter could use against us. The more it discovers about us, the more closely it can mimic me and Faye and her family members, living or dead. When she's asleep, Faye is highly susceptible to suggestion. The running hypothesis that No Sleep has developed is that there are certain things that the imposter needs to know about Faye in order to fully infiltrate her, to control her, to kill her. We don't know what it really plans to do with her though, but we do know that it is especially curious about the significance of the number 5, which Faye drew on the window while sleepwalking. She gets agitated anytime 5 is brought up, but cannot coherently explain why. I think that once it learns the meaning of the number, it'll have full access to Faye, and it'll be able to do whatever it's planning with her. I sat on my couch with my laptop and Skyped Laura around 10 p.m. one night at our new place, about a half hour after Faye had fallen asleep. I had to be extremely aggressive in order to break Laura's wall of lies about her family's past. And just when she seemed ready to crack, Faye walked out of the bedroom. We now live in a 1-story house. It was dark in the hall, so she scared the shit out of me when I saw the movement out of the corner of my eye. She stood there in the shadows, rigid and tall. Her entire body was stiff. Her head was cranked all the way back in a painful-looking position. Her chin pointed towards the ceiling. Her arms were straight up in the air in a hallelujah gesture. She hadn't sleptwalked in a while now, so I immediately told Laura I would call her back and jumped up. Faye shushed me and then wiggled her fingers, arms still outstretched. She looked like a praying mantis in the pose. I asked, "Faye, what is it?" She smiled and replied, "Did you know about her?" She closed her hands and one of the fingers pointed at the ceiling. I said I didn't know what she was talking about and asked, "What? No what?" I looked up at the ceiling and saw nothing. Faye paused. She typically pauses for long periods between sentences while sleepwalking. Then she said, "There's an old woman up there. She lives in the attic. She's so friendly. She remembered my birthday." My skin crawled. It felt like insects skittering under my clothing when she said it. Faye says a lot of disturbing things. I've grown used to it. But occasionally, she still surprises me. I asked her once more about this old woman, and she said, "She sleeps right over our bed." Faye brought her arms down at her sides and her muscles relaxed. She stopped answering my questions. I walked her back into the bedroom and gently tucked her in. That night, I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. I imagined the corpse of an old woman stuck inside the drywall or dangling from the rafters in the attic. I couldn't shake the feeling that our unwanted house guest had moved with us and was now pretending to be a friendly stranger just to trick Faye. That night, I dreamed of a dark stain spreading itself across the ceiling in the shape of a large man, just like the vomit stains on our old house a few weeks prior. As I was falling asleep, I thought I heard something heavy dragging itself around up there. Laura, Faye's mom, called me the following evening. Faye wasn't yet home from work, so we had a good hour-long conversation before things got uncomfortable. I had to spend a lot of time getting her back into that emotional space where she could open up about her daughter. And when she finally did, I was astonished. It felt like the first time Laura had ever told me the truth about anything. Now, I don't have proof that she was being honest, but I could hear it in her voice. It is true that when Faye was 5 years old, she developed her unusual sleep disorder. But the number 5 doesn't symbolize that. It goes a lot deeper. As I mentioned before in the previous updates, Faye's parents lied to me and told me that she had been visiting Pikes Peak regularly throughout her lifetime until she was 13. And yet, Faye claimed that she had never been there before. Ever. In reality, Faye went there a few times as a child, but her last visit was at age 5. She and her father Greg were outside building a snowman, and then Faye just kind of wandered off into the tree line and began speaking to someone that Greg couldn't see. She spoke her own name and said a few other things that Greg couldn't hear. And then she had some sort of seizure and became catatonic. When she came to, she cried for hours. But there was apparently more to the story. Just as Faye got home from work and walked in the door, I heard Laura say that a few months before that, I was pregnant. The second I covered the mouthpiece and said, "Hi, sweetie," Laura hung up the phone. I kept this revelation to myself for a while. Laura didn't return my calls after Faye went to bed, so I never found out what happened to her pregnancy. Did she have a miscarriage, an abortion? Did she give the baby up for adoption? Was it not Greg's child? A million questions swarmed my mind. I couldn't sleep at all. I could barely hide my thoughts from Faye. She knew something was wrong. She's quite perceptive and she can read me like a book. But I acted like I had a stomachache and went up to bed. That night, I had an absolutely terrible dream. Probably the worst one I have ever had. In it, an adult Faye attacked her pregnant mother. She was sleepwalking but screaming wildly and pummeling her mother. Just like she had pummeled the guest door when her sister and infant nephew, Becca and Caleb, visited us last month. There was blood everywhere in the dream. And then Faye ran off into the woods with the fetus. It was so violent I jolted awake, nearly screaming. When I woke up, Faye was sitting upright in bed, staring out the window. She was awake. I could tell because her posture was normal, and her eyes weren't rolled in the back of the head or blissfully sealed shut. She said, "Did you hear that too?" It took me a while to figure out where I was. When I saw her sitting there in a pristine white t-shirt, I sighed in relief. There was no blood anywhere. It was just a dream. But before I could answer her question, I heard a baby crying. We live in a bigger suburban neighborhood now, so it was entirely possible that it was just sound from one of the nearby houses. But Faye's reaction to it really disturbed me. The look on her face made me think that it was causing her physical pain. She cringed and shut her eyes, trying not to cry. I cupped her face in my hands and told her it was okay. But as I did that, another voice ran out in the darkness. It was a little girl, and she was speaking as if to a baby. From what I could hear, she said, "When do we go inside?" "Up in the trees?" "Where?" "Not in the hole. Not down there." Starting to cry. Faye started crying too. I looked out the window but couldn't see anything. She had no explanation as for why she was so upset, other than, "He's back. He's here. I know it's him." I didn't want to scare her, but I completely agreed. I missed a call from Nathan the next morning when I woke up. It was Saturday and Faye and I had plans to go get new furniture at IKEA. While she was in the shower, I returned Nathan's call. He answered on the first ring. He sounded terrible. The first thing he said was, "Felix, do you know anything about the child?" A few weeks prior, he had said, "Tell me about the child," and I had no idea what he was talking about. Now, I had a pretty clear idea. So I whispered to him that Faye's mother had been pregnant when Faye was 5, but I had no idea what became of the baby. He told me to get as much information from Laura as possible, at all cost, but keep it from Faye. He also told me that he was going to mail us a special herbal mixture to make in our tea before bed. He said that it promotes good dreams, and therefore would help shield us from some of the imposter's intrusions. I asked Nathan to explain what he meant, and he said very simply, "The imposter does not read minds. It reads dreams." This was an astonishing revelation to me. It explained so much about the cabin. The imposter mimicked Faye's grandfather because she had probably had a dream about him at the cabin, and it mimicked my mother for the same reason. It mimicked the people that Greg saw die in the war because he frequently had nightmares about it. The former owner of the cabin, Jennifer, heard her dead daughter's voice in the forest at night because she would regularly dream about her. Who wouldn't have painful memories of their own child passing away? The creature mimics the people it learns about through the dreams of its victims, and it repeats them in the forest to coax the victim outside. It also listens to the things people say while they're awake. This is why we heard so many unrecognizable but familiar voices at the same time. Some of those voices belong to other victims. That thing wanders around in the dark, learning from its targets, sharpening its skills, and pretending. This is how it hunts. Since we're getting nearer to the significance of the number 5, the information that the imposter so desperately sought, Faye was in greater danger. My own dreams could betray our safety. Nathan continued. I'm paraphrasing here because I can't remember everything verbatim. Faye is the most fascinating person the imposter has ever encountered. Her dreams are mysterious to it. She is a puzzle to be solved, and most of all, when it speaks through her dreams, she speaks back. I guess you could say it has a very dark fixation with her. Perhaps even love. A putrid form of it, anyway. It was true. Faye mirrored the imposter's darkness. When it looked into her, it didn't find all the hopes and dreams and fears it saw in others. Instead, it saw a deep well of impenetrable blackness, and it knew that there was something hidden beneath it. Whatever it plans to do with the information that it seeks, it knows that 5 will light the trail to reveal what's at the bottom of that well, and everything inside of it. Cold sweat matted every inch of my skin during this conversation. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear as to not miss a word. I asked, why does it even need Faye to find the answer? Her parents probably know what the number means too. Nathan then said something in his native language, as though he were speaking to a person sitting in the room with him. Then he said to me, her parents haven't been to the cabin in a very long time, so its connection to them is weak. Maybe it can't keep a hold of someone for very long if they aren't on the mountain. After all, Faye has had her sleep disorder since she first went to Pikes Peak. As the years passed, the entity faded from her life. It only returned when she came back. I heard the shower shut off and the glass door slide open. Faye began moving around in the bathroom, so I walked outside onto the patio and closed the door behind me. But what does it want, Nathan? I asked him. I mean, once it learns everything it needs, what does it plan to do? Nobody will give me a straight answer. Again, Nathan said something that I couldn't understand. He definitely was talking to someone else. Perhaps one of the elders of his community were with him. It's one of the old evils, he said. Our people have believed in them since the beginning. When a person dies, they become a... what do you call them? A wraith, a haunting. But these entities were here long before. So many horror films Faye and I had cheerfully watched came flooding into mind. So, like a demon? I said. I can't tell you how many movies I've seen where a family finds out that the ghost in their house is actually a demon. And for a few obscure reasons, that's much worse. I felt like I was about to be given that speech. Nathan cleared his throat. Well, no, not exactly. We don't believe in hell or any equivalent place. Our interpretation of the other worlds is very complex. But basically, this type of entity, they take you away. Not your body, but your spirit. They take you out into the dark, away from this world and its light. So far away, eternities upon eternities away. The distance drives your spirit completely mad. And then you become one of them. That's what it does. It separates you from where you're supposed to go in the afterlife. It steals you from yourself. So, yeah, good news all around. I also asked Nathan how he was coping after his father's death, and I pointed out that he sounded especially dreary today. Again, I expressed my condolences and said that I was most honored to have known T-Way, and that we're alive because of him. Nathan replied that he knows his father's spirit lives on through the family, and in the sacred earth where they live, and for that reason, he doesn't mourn his death. However, Nathan also said something that made my hand go cold as I clutched the phone. He said, I keep having the same nightmare every night. It keeps me awake when it's over. I'm exhausted. I asked him to tell me about the dream, as I was having terrible ones lately too. He said, it's in the cabin. I can see it in my dreams. It's sitting there in the dark, and there's a bad storm. I'm standing in the distance looking at it. The lights turn out inside, and I walk towards it. As I approach, the front door slowly opens, and something in my heart tells me not to step inside, but I do. Every time I do. When I'm inside, the light cuts out, and it's very dark. From the living room, I can hear my father's voice calling to me from the bedroom. He's speaking in our native language. He sounds happy and peaceful. He tells me to come to him, and that he wants to see my face before he goes on with our ancestors. He calls me my light, the nickname he gave to me as a child. But when I go to push the bedroom door open, I awake to the sound of a child crying every time. Nathan went on to explain that he feels these dreams are a sign that we must return to the cabin into the site of T-Way's death. I said it could be a trap, you know. In fact, I'm sure it is. Nathan spoke once more in his language to whoever was in the room with him, and then paused. He finally sighed and said, "You might be right, but it really feels like him." I made him promise not to go back to the cabin. He agreed, and said he would call me in a few days. I thanked him again for his father's sacrifice. A few days passed in relative peace. Laura didn't return my calls, and Becca, Faye's sister, didn't return my text messages. The standoffishness of this family just drives me insane. When Faye and I got home from grocery shopping one evening, a package had arrived in the mail. It contained the herbs that Nathan had talked about, with instructions on how to make the tea. "Not too much," read the little note. Faye brewed up some tea and drank it, and when she was finished, I jokingly told her that, "Actually, we're sending you on a vision quest. This is going to be really intense." She was not amused. We both slept soundly that night. No dreams, no strange activity outside, no weird noises, nothing. The next morning, there was a knock on the door, so light that it only woke me up. I'm a light-sleeping insomniac. I snuck out of bed and tried not to wake Faye up, and then I crept to the front door. It was Laura. She had come to our new home, totally unannounced and uninvited. I immediately knew that there was about to be a shitstorm. I couldn't begin to imagine what she was doing here, but I knew by the look on her face that it was trouble. I invited her inside and informed her that Faye was still asleep. She was actually relieved and told me that she wanted to talk to me alone. From her bag, she produced a photo album. We sat on the couch and she quietly apologized to me for everything. For constantly being evasive, for lying, and for letting us go to the cabin in the first place. I waved away her ramblings and demanded to know the purpose of her visit. I had absolutely had enough of all of this, and I wanted to get to the bottom of things. Laura dropped her voice to a whisper and opened up the photo album. As she turned the pages, I realized that it was actually a scrapbook. A very elaborate one, too. Must have taken years to construct. There were photos, drawings, designs, letters, postcards, even a necklace and some flattened flowers. I saw pictures of Faye that I had never seen before. She was absolutely adorable as a child. Her glowing smile poked out from beneath little strawberry locks in photo after photo. Laura said, "This is what I wanted to show you. I don't know how to talk to Faye about it." I was amazed. It took expert handiwork to craft something like this. "You made this?" I asked. She flipped further and further into the scrapbook and revealed a few older pictures of herself in the late stages of her pregnancy. The centerpiece in one of the pages was a photograph of Laura, big-bellied and wearing a youthful smile, and a little 5-year-old Faye, curiously resting her ear on her mommy's tummy. The image was priceless, and it was one that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. "Faye and I put this together, actually," she said, "when she was very little." It made sense to me. Faye was one of the most talented arts and crafts hobbyists I had ever known. "So, what happened?" I asked. Laura looked over her shoulder down the hall. She obviously feared that Faye would wake up. "His name was Christopher," she said, tears welling up in her eyes as she spoke. She turned the page and there was a photo of Laura undergoing an ultrasound giving the thumbs up. "He was a stillborn, a little over a month before the due date." I had no idea what to say. I felt that saying "I'm sorry" was too empty, but I just remained silent. "Placenta abruption," she continued. It's rare, but it happens. She scooted closer to me on the couch and set the scrapbook on my lap, then grabbed my wrist. She said, "Felix, Faye doesn't remember any of this. We have never, ever spoken about it." I asked her how that could be possible, given that she was certainly old enough to remember an event like this. Laura explained that the emergency occurred while Greg was out with the girls. The paramedics rushed Laura to the hospital, but the baby couldn't be saved. When she and Greg finally decided to break the news to their daughters that Christopher had died, Becca was heartbroken. But Faye didn't react. It was almost as if they were telling her something that simply didn't register. Laura would say, "Do you understand that Christopher is never coming home?" And Faye would respond, "Yes, Mommy," with a blank expression. This apparently went on for weeks. Faye would occasionally ask about Christopher, as if he would be visiting soon. Then suddenly, she'd not remember anything about him, as if he never existed. She began to act out in school. She would throw violent tantrums for no reason. A child psychologist warned that Faye was not handling the situation well, so Laura and Greg decided to spend several days up at the cabin with the girls, in hopes of separating Faye's mind from the heavy event. And that's when it happened. Whatever lives in the forest up there, up in the trees or down in the hole, took notice of Faye. It wanted to learn more about her, but her little brain shut down in terror whenever it got too close. Laura said after that day, Faye never spoke of Christopher again, and seems completely unaware that he ever existed. Suddenly, Faye's voice erupted from behind us. She was standing in the hallway, perhaps for a long time. I slammed shut the scrapbook and the air just went out of the room. There was an agonizingly long moment of stillness, during which all of us exchanged surprised looks. "What's that?" she finally asked, pointing to the scrapbook on my lap. I was useless, a deer in the headlights. Laura got up and got in between me and Faye, giving her a hug and asked her how she was feeling. She said that they needed to talk, but Faye pushed her aside and walked over to the couch. Her fiery eyes locked on the scrapbook, and she didn't even blink. She reached down and opened it. The page she revealed, it had a colorful cutout of the number 5. It was one of the final pages of the scrapbook. Her jaw trembled and tears instantly welled up in her eyes. A look of excruciating pain fell over her face. She began hyperventilating. Laura rounded the couch and tried to assuage her, but Faye slapped her hand away and grabbed the scrapbook. She raced off into the bedroom. She cried for hours, never letting us in. I spent the rest of the day alone. Faye never emerged from the bedroom, and wouldn't speak to me when I knocked. So I played Overwatch to distract myself from the horrible knot of stress in my stomach. Meanwhile, texting my best friends, Richard and Jason, regarding the new developments. When I got up to get a drink, I heard the bedroom door click. Faye was ready to let me in. She was sitting on the bed with the scrapbook in her lap when I pushed the door open. I said as gently as I could, "You want to talk about it?" Her face was streaked with hundreds of tears. Her skin was pale, her eyes were lifeless. I had never seen her in such a state. I considered calling the paramedics in fear that she might hurt herself or me. All she said was, "I remember now." I stood there in the doorway, afraid to move. I wasn't sure exactly how Faye would react to the knowledge that I had been conspiring with her mother about their secret past. "Mom and I spent all summer getting the nursery set up," she said, tracing a finger over one of the photos. "Dad was so excited he was finally going to have a son. So we did a sports theme." I walked over to the bed and sat down, quiet as a lamb, trying not to trigger another explosion. Faye kept her hands pressed on the scrapbook, as though she was feeling for a pulse. The colorful number 5 rested at the center of the page, laid over several photos at once. There was a baseball mural painted on the wall with 5 players, and another, a toddler onesie, in the design of a basketball jersey. It too displayed the number 5. Faye started crying again and choked out, "Christopher was going to be the 5th member of our family." We talked for a long time. Well, mostly Faye talked. I just quietly watched her face in awe as the deluge of ancient memories flooded her mind. Sometimes she could barely speak. Other times she just shook her head and said that it was all a dream. Her denial rose and fell in waves, and then she grasped at the faded images in her head and tried to describe them to me with this great strain. There was a tomb. A tomb had been unearthed, and Faye was excavating it despite all the pain it wrought on her. All I could do was hold her hand through it. That night, I made some of Nathan's tea again, and we both drank it. Faye fell asleep, and I stayed awake watching Netflix. Just as I was about to shut off the computer, I heard a rustling outside, and then the voice of a little girl. She said, "It's Faye. I can't see you. Who are you?" I walked down the hall and peered out the blinds in the living room. A dark figure walked right past the window, scaring me half to death. It came from our backyard, and no doubt it had been standing outside our bedroom window. I ran down the hall and grabbed my sweats and shoes. Then I bolted out the door and looked all around the property. There, across the road, standing under a street lamp, was this man. His body glowed in the pale yellow light, but his face was totally black. He looked nearly 7 feet tall, and one of his shoulders was noticeably higher than the other one. His posture was rigid and reminiscent of Faye when she sleptwalked. I knew exactly who it was. I can't explain what prompted me to run after him, but I wanted to grab this thing by his neck and beat him to death with my bare hands. Perhaps it was because I was so tired of my fear and it just hadn't kicked in yet. Or perhaps I had just had enough. But instead of clawing me to death right there in the street, the figure turned and ran. I chased after him, screaming at the top of my lungs, "Stay the fuck away from my house and my family!" The thing moved very fast, but it limped with a freakish gait. My mind envisioned a rail-thin creature made of oily black parts, stretching on the costume of a human being and gracelessly lurching around in it. This thing was not a person. Its movements were animalistic. Its strides were far too long. Its breath wheezed like the air in an old antique accordion, and the stench that it dragged behind, it stung my nose. It smelled like wildfire. "No woods for you to fuck around in out here!" I screamed. Lights flicked on in all the houses around me. I chased the figure. It practically galloped. It was always 20 feet ahead of me. I chased it down for 2 blocks. It rounded a few turns and finally bounded over a chain-link fence into the community park, where there were no lights. I couldn't see the damn thing, so I had to run all the way around to the other side to get in. The only thing I could see was a silhouette. The figure stood there in an empty field, shrouded by the night, gazing up at the moon. The silver outline of its body indicated that it was facing away from me. One of its hands twitched wildly. The other one gnarled up like driftwood. The sight of it out here, so far from help, unnerved me. I approached it still, committed to ending this nightmare tonight, one way or another. My courage evaporated about 10 feet away from the creature, when it issued a growl that I can't even describe. It was so deep, I felt it in my ribcage as I heard it. I stopped in my tracks, but I still managed to say, "You will never take her. You will never have Faye. You will leave us alone forever. Go back to your fucking mountain and bury yourself in a mine. It growled again, then gurgled up a wet laugh. What is your name? It asked in my voice. It had been practicing. It was almost perfect now. May I come in? How do you carry on a conversation with an entity that is basically a demonic parrot? I said much louder than before, you will leave us alone and go back to your mountain. Faye will never be yours. The imposter emitted the shriek of an infant. The sound startled me. It felt so wrong coming out of the form of such a large man. Then it said in the voice of a child, you go down in the hole. That's where he'll put you. Look at me, you piece of shit, I said, trying to sound menacing. But in reality, I'm a coward, and most people can sense it. So there's little doubt that the imposter knew it too. Then it said something that I didn't expect. The sound threw me off so much my head spun. Tell me about the child, it said. Nathan's voice wafted gently from its throat. Tell me about the child. Before I could speak, the imposter whirled around and squared off with me. There are no words to express the combination of shock and instant despair that I felt. My knees came straight out from under me. I fell onto the wet grass. Staring down at me, boring into me with lidless eyes, was the face of Nathan, my friend, my protector, the son of a man who had given his life to help me. Now, his skin was hard and bruised, his scalp flayed, his eyes tormented. He had been stretched over the skull that didn't quite fit, in a body that rattled with loose, collected bones. A slimy black liquid dribbled down the arms. Maybe it was blood. It was too dark to tell. It spoke in the phrase of a language of Nathan's people, the same one Nathan had uttered over the phone that made us sick. I began vomiting profusely and laid there on the ground. Tell me about the child, it said once more, then smiled. The lips spread and stretched into an expression of malevolent joy, bearing the rotting maw of a long dead wolf. Nathan's calm voice seeped out of it. Let me speak to the one who followed you home. I gasped for air, but I couldn't command my body to move. The creature took a few steps towards me, and I slammed my eyes shut, expecting those hideous fangs to go into my neck. Instead, I heard its footsteps approach, and then recede into the opposite direction. When I opened my eyes, the imposter had stepped over me and was just walking away. It was already in the distance, moving quickly. Back towards my neighborhood, towards my house. Followed you home, it repeated, echoing into the cold night air. Followed you home. Followed you home. Guys, thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoy the story. And please go buy the author's book. It's really good. I bought one for my grandma. I think she'll like it. And now a thank you to the $10 and above patrons in order of money, naturally. Dan R., Paul Z., Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa Chaos X, JY Pyromancer, Hayden MH, and Ethan A. Guys, I hope you enjoy the story. Thank you to all the $5 patrons down in the description. You guys are fantastic too. Don't worry, I love you too. Also, for patrons and patrons only, If you have any idea of what you want the next Patreon exclusive story to be, please make sure you message it to me on there, because I don't know what to pick. There's so many. So I'd like to hear from you. Again, guys, thank you so much. And if you want access to Patreon-only stories, getting your name read off at the end, having your name in the description, go over to Patreon. Thank you.